The cause of depression. First of all, we need to clarify that depression is not a cause. You see, when you vomit and have a diarrhea, the diagnosis caused given by the doctor is influenza virus. When you suffer from insomnia and you feel hopeless and suicidal, you go to the doctor and you are diagnosed with depression. But depression is not like influenza virus that is causing you the insomnia and the hopelessness and the suicidal thoughts. So depression is not a cause. Depression is simply a term used to describe the cluster of symptoms that you are experiencing. In most cases, no one actually knows the exact cause of your depression. But it is widely agreed that depression is multifactorial. The contributing factors could include endogenous or internal factors, that is biochemistry and genetics. Biochemistry refers to the disruption of neurochemicals in your brains that can trigger low moods. Genetics says there could be a combination of genes you inherited that predispose you to depression. And then there are exogenous or external factors, that is your personality and your life situations. For example, people with low self-esteem are easily overcome by stress, hence depressed. And there are life situations that are stressful life events such as abuse and neglect, or the love of lost ones, that can trigger depression. Now, a common question Christians ask is depression physiological or is depression biological? Many Christians feel like that's the first thing they must know about different depression, because they feel that if that is the case, then just take the drugs. But let me quote Armand Nicolai. He's a clinical professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. Listen to what he said. Although we have made great strides in biochemistry and neurophysiology of the brain and an understanding of the neural basis and the localization of certain feelings and certain thought processes in the brain, we still fail to find any metabolic or physiological abnormality consistently present in any of the major psychiatric illnesses, including depression. Even when and if we find this magic abnormal metabolite, we will only be halfway home, for we still won't know whether the abnormality causes or results from the disorder. Paradoxically, the more we learn about the mind, the more we realize that we can never reduce human thoughts, feelings, or behavior to mere biochemical reactions. You see, in a nutshell, Professor Armand is saying, yes, chemicals and biology is involved, but depression is so much more complex than mere biochemicals imbalance. Other factors, psychological factors and situational factors, are also at play. Now, such understanding of depression being multifactorial matches and sits very nicely with my biblical understanding of humanity and of the world as the Bible reveals it. God's Word shows us the reality of the world that we live in today. We all, like sheep, has gone astray. And that going astray has fractured the world more deeply than we can imagine. And in this sin-fractured world, there will always be suffering. And the cause of the suffering is not always clear. And depression is one such suffering. And its exact cause for each individual may not always be clear. So, could your depression be a consequence of other people's sin? Possibly. Say, if someone sinned against you, abused you emotionally, physically, or sexually, as a victim, you would likely suffer depression. If you grew up in an unstable family, never knew when your parents would sin and fight and flare up, or when your unpredictable alcoholic father would return, you would be depressed. How about, could your depression be a consequence of your own sin? Possibly. For example, a lifestyle of drugs and alcohol abuse, addiction to porn, relationships involving sexual sin, they can all damage us and they can come out in depression. Or you can have an idol in your life that cannot live up to your expectations, and it brings your whole world crashing and crumbling down. And that could cause depression. And could our depression be simply part of living in this broken world? Not a direct consequence of anyone's sins, my sin or other people's sins? Possibly. When you lose a loved one to cancer, no one directly sinned, but your grief can trigger depression. Or your physical, fallen body could play up without anyone sinning. Your biochemical balance can be disrupted, you can suffer from thyroid disorder, and depression can befall. So you see, God's word shows me the extent of the pain and the suffering that sin has brought upon us. So it allows me to be okay, not to know the exact cause of depression. It may not always be clear, and that is okay. Ed Welch helpfully points out that we can love and minister to the depressed without knowing the cause of depression. In fact, it frees us up as supporters from scrambling for that single theory before you can start caring for and loving the depressed. Let me share with you, as a form of illustration of what I just said. I have a Christian friend who still takes antidepressant up till today. She is probably in her late 50s now. When she and her husband served as missionaries in Tanzania, they lost one of their twins at birth. Later, still in Tanzania, she was held at gunpoint at home. And then one day, one of their surviving twin was playing in the backyard and fell from a tree. The injury went undiagnosed because of poor health care. When the boy could finally talk, they realized that one of his eyes suffered irreversible damage, and that left him blind on one eye for the rest of his life. That's a lot happening, isn't it, in the situation of a person's life? And my friend was diagnosed with depression in Tanzania and was treated in a psychiatric ward. Well, she's back in Australia now for a couple of years already, and both the husband, wife, and the family is living there. She fights against low mood every single winter. And she also learned that depression runs in her family, father and grandfather. Now, let me ask, what exactly caused the depression? Biochemistry? Genetics? Situational? Seasonal? Spiritual? Who knows, isn't it? Who knows? Now, there are two common interrelated questions concerning the cause of depression. Let me address them. The first is depression sinful? is depression sinful? Now, we can't find the word depression in the Bible, but we can certainly find the experience of depression, darkness, anguish, hopelessness, isolation, fear, despair, anxiety, written all across the Bible. Many of the psalmists will meet the criteria of what we call depression today. In Psalm 88, the psalmist actually never got out of depression. The psalm ended with him still depressed, without hope. This says something, doesn't it? According to the Bible, there is a right place to be depressed. Being depressed is a reasonable response when confronted with sin and the pain in this broken world. So depression in itself is not sinful. It is suffering. However, could there be sinful components involved in the midst of depression? Possibly. For example, in my depression, I could be tempted to sin in order to feel better. I could lash out, I could indulge in porn or alcohol or drugs. But the experience of depression in itself is not sin. My response was sinful, but the experience of depression, the anguish, the hopelessness, the recurring suicidal thoughts, that is suffering, not sin. The second related question is depression spiritual? And the question often goes something like this. Now, there are biochemical and situational factors involved in depression, but is there a spiritual dimension to depression? In other words, when someone is depressed, is there not a spiritual root cause to be dealt with? Don't we need to dig and hunt and deal with this spiritual root cause in order to get rid of the depression? This is a common mindset of many Christians who attempt to love the depressed. Now, while I recognize the sincerity of this concern, this posture is also misguided and can be unhelpful. You see, as I've said earlier, depression is often multifactorial. The cause of suffering is not always clear. Sometimes depression can even come and go without us finding out what is the cause. So don't be obsessed or oversimplistic in your attempt to problem solve. Remember that you can love the depressed without knowing the cause. Now, I may not know the cause. I may not know how I ended up in this dark and gloomy place called depression. But while I'm in this miserable place, I can often see things, other things about myself, about my heart, that I couldn't before, compared to when I'm in good times. It is common, isn't it? When I'm in suffering, I could see more clearly what I fear and what annoys me and what disappoints me. And all of that gives me greater spiritual insight of myself. And that is a good thing.